So that's the first factor that affects the weight, the magnitude of the driving force. And we can compare this graph. We can look at the concentration gradient directly compared to the net flux, and we can see a directly proportional linear relationship. So as the concentration gradient gets bigger, so does the rate or the net flux or the net movement of particles also get bigger, right? And that is reflected by this linear, directly proportional line that we see here when we look at the concentration gradient. So if the gradient gets bigger, the rate of movement gets bigger, gradient gets smaller, the rate of movement gets smaller as well. The second factor that affects the rate of simple diffusion is the membrane surface area. So how much membrane do we have exposed for transfer of particles across? And this electron micrograph here looks at the alveoli of the lungs. And we can see in healthy lungs on the left here, we've got a lot of surface area for the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So this is what constitutes healthy alveoli in healthy lung tissue. And so that would make sense, right? The lungs are particularly important for that gas exchange where we have to get rid of carbon dioxide, we have to absorb oxygen into the blood. And so in order for that to be effective, we need more surface area for that diffusion to take place. On the right, we can see unhealthy lungs or collapsed alveoli where they're really large and there's not the same amount of surface area present here. So the rate of movement of things like oxygen and carbon dioxide is going to be significantly slower or lower because we don't have the same amount of exposed surface area for this type of exchange to take place. And so this is a really good example of where membrane surface area influences the rate of transport and the effectiveness of transport as well. Another really simple way to explain this, or another simple example, is if you think about having two containers that have a semi-permeable membrane separating them both, and let's say they both have a rate of 5 particles per minute. If we join those containers together and we join the membrane together so that we have more membrane across both the containers, right? We just combine them together. We would now have a rate of 10 particles per minute because we simply joined those membranes. So if we have more membrane, more space for stuff to get across, we're gonna have a faster rate of movement, a faster transfer of particles across that membrane. The third factor that affects the rate is going to be the membrane permeability, okay? So the first factor, the magnitude of the driving force. The second factor, the amount of space available for transport. And then the third factor makes sense, right? Whether or not the membrane is permeable to the particle in question. If we have a high concentration gradient, let's say we had a lot of particles on one side and almost no particle on the other side, even though we have a really strong driving force because of a really strong gradient, if the membrane is not permeable to the particle, then the rate is still going to be 0. So the permeability of the membrane is an important factor in determining the rate of transport. And then there are some other factors that will influence the permeability itself, okay? So the lipid solubility of the substance or particle, right? That's the first and kind of most obvious factor. If the particle is charged, if the particle is water soluble, if it's polar, it's not going to go through the membrane as easily as non-polar substances, as carbon dioxide, as water, as smaller lipid soluble particles will, okay? So the first factor that affects the membrane permeability is the lipid solubility of the substance or particle that's being diffused. The second factor that affects the permeability is the size and shape of the particle. If we have large, bulky particles, they are not going to go through the membrane. If they're awkwardly or irregularly shaped, they're also not going to diffuse as easily as smaller particles will. So the size and bulkiness, the shape of the particle will influence whether or not it's going to go through that membrane, whether or not the membrane is going to be permeable to it as well. The temperature of the environment is going to influence the weight or the permeability of the membrane. This is not as relevant for human physiology, for our physiology, simply because we have a set core body temperature and we don't really deviate very far from that within the bounds of homeostasis. So while a warmer environment, while heat will increase the rate of movement of particles, right? Particles are going to be moving faster if they're exposed to higher temperature. This is not as relevant for us because we're not really exposed to high heat or to the extremes of temperature. We're pretty much set at that core temperature, but it is also interesting to know that heat or increased temperature is going to increase the rate of movement of particles, which will also increase their movement across a membrane as well. And then the fourth factor here that affects the permeability is obviously the thickness of the membrane. This one is kind of very intuitive. If we have a thicker membrane, we have more stuff for these particles to get through, whereas if we have a thinner membrane, we have less stuff or impeding surface area for the particles to get through. So if we have a thicker membrane, we have a slower rate of transport. If we've got a thinner membrane, we have a faster rate of transport. And a really interesting example of this is when we think about those membranes for transport in our body. Think about, again, the alveoli, very thin epithelial layer, one cell layer thick. These are also flat cells. We call them squamous cells because they have to be suitable for the movement of particles, especially in the areas where gas exchange is important. Again, thinking about the lungs, the alveoli, and so on. Another good example is the GI tract, right, where we have the absorption of nutrients and biomolecules across the epithelial layer of the GI. This also needs to be a thin membrane to facilitate a faster, more effective rate of transport of particles going across. So if we've got a thicker membrane, we have a slower rate. And so a thinner membrane is more suitable for a faster rate of transport, and it makes the membrane more permeable to those particles. And we can look at this graph here on the right, where we can see the concentration gradient again being compared to the net flux. And then we see two distinct curves or two lines which are showing the difference in permeability. If we have a high permeability and we have the same gradient, we see a faster rate of movement, whereas if we have a low permeability with that exact same gradient, we see a slower rate of transport across that membrane, okay? So we want to take all these factors into account as we talk about the rate of transport across the membrane. We want to talk about the magnitude of the force. We want to talk about the amount of surface area available. We want to talk about the permeability. And then we also want to think about the distinct factors that are affecting the permeability as well. Okay. All right, so let's pause here and see if you've got any questions. We're almost out of time, so we'll probably reserve these checkpoint questions for next time, but you can think about them as homework so that we can discuss them when we meet on Friday.